You have probably walked past it 100 times this week without looking twice. It is small, brown, unremarkable in every visible way, and almost everyone ignores it completely. But there is something happening inside that ordinary-looking bird that most people in the birding world have never been told. The house sparrow is the most studied wild bird on the planet, with more peer-reviewed research than any other backyard species. And what that research has found is so far from what most people assume that it genuinely changes the way you see your yard. Not in a poetic sense. In a documented, reproducible, peer-reviewed sense that took scientists decades to accept. Before we get into what scientists found, I want you to think about what you already know about this bird. You know it is small. You know it shows up at feeders in groups. You know it is everywhere, and you have never given it much thought. That is exactly the reaction this bird has been engineering for 10,000 years. But the reason it does that is something researchers only recently figured out. Welcome to Feather Logic. Subscribe before you leave, because what you are about to learn happens every single morning in your yard and most people never find out. The house sparrow arrived in North America in 1851 when a small group was released in Brooklyn, New York, to help control insects. Within 50 years, it had spread to every corner of the continent, from Alaska to Mexico, from the Pacific coast to Newfoundland. That kind of range expansion, that fast, with no human assistance after the initial release, has almost no parallel in vertebrate biology. Most species introduced to new environments fail. They struggle with unfamiliar predators, unfamiliar food, unfamiliar climate, and they disappear quietly within a generation or two. The house sparrow did not fail. It did something researchers still consider one of the most remarkable adaptive events ever recorded in a wild bird species. It changed. Not over thousands of generations the way most evolution works. It changed within a few generations in ways that were measurable and documented. By the early 1900s, house sparrows in the northern United States had already developed different body proportions than house sparrows in the southern states. Larger bodies in cold climates. Smaller, leaner bodies in warm ones. The same species, diverging into regional variants in under a century. Evolutionary biologists call this a natural experiment in real-time adaptation, because the starting population and the timeline are both known with precision. This is not common. This is, in the language of biology, extraordinary. And it happened in the bird most people brush past without a second glance. But the body size changes are not the remarkable part. The remarkable part starts in the brain, and it starts with a question researchers were not expecting to ask. In the early 2000s, a group of ornithologists began comparing the brain structure of house sparrows in urban environments to house sparrows in rural ones. They expected minor differences, the kind of subtle variations you find between any two populations of the same species living in different conditions. What they found instead stopped the study and generated a wave of follow-up research that is still producing papers today. The hippocampus in urban house sparrows, the region of the brain associated with spatial memory and cognitive flexibility, was measurably larger. Not slightly larger. Large enough to be statistically significant across hundreds of samples, large enough that it showed up consistently in every city they tested. Urban house sparrows had literally grown more brain in the regions that handle complex problem-solving, spatial mapping, and behavioral flexibility. Rural house sparrows, living in more stable, predictable environments, showed no equivalent change. The difference was tied specifically to the cognitive demands of the urban landscape. What that means is this. Your yard, and every yard like it, has been selecting for intelligence in this species for over 100 years. The house sparrows at your feeder today are not the same cognitively as house sparrows living in fields or forests. They are measurably smarter. And the mechanism behind that smartness turns out to be deeply, specifically tied to how they relate to you and to every other human in your neighborhood. Here's what the research found about how house sparrows perceive individual humans, and this is where the story gets difficult to dismiss. House sparrows in urban environments develop what researchers call individual human recognition with a speed and accuracy that exceeds most other small songbird species. In a series of field experiments run at multiple European and North American universities, house sparrows were exposed to specific humans who either fed them or disturbed their nests. Within 3 to 5 days of initial exposure, the sparrows began responding differently to those specific individuals, even when those individuals changed clothing, wore hats, or approached from different directions. The recognition was facial. It was persistent. And it was transmitted socially to other sparrows that had never directly interacted with the individual in question. If one house sparrow in a group learned that a specific person was a threat, nearby sparrows who had no personal experience with that person began showing avoidance behavior. The information moved through the flock faster than any individual bird could have learned it through direct experience. It moved socially, through observation and what researchers call cultural transmission. You have seen this happen without knowing what you were watching. Think about a time when you approached a group of sparrows at a feeder and some flew, but others did not. The ones that stayed were not being reckless. They were making an individual assessment based on prior information about you specifically, transmitted to them through social learning. The ones that flew may have been newer arrivals, birds that had not yet accumulated enough data about you to update their risk calculation in your favor. This is not instinct in the simple sense. Instinct would mean they all behave the same way regardless of who you are. They do not all behave the same way. Their response to you is individually calibrated, socially updated, and stored in a memory system that researchers have now confirmed persists for months. A house sparrow that spent the winter at your feeder has a file on you. Not a metaphorical file. A real neural representation of your behavior, your schedule, and your threat level. Researchers at Oxford confirmed this through a displacement experiment. Sparrows familiar with a specific feeder location were moved several miles away and released in an unfamiliar area. When returned to their home territory weeks later, they immediately resumed their prior behavior patterns, including their individual responses to specific humans they had known before. The memory had not degraded. The assessment had not reset. They came back knowing exactly who you were and what they had previously decided about you. Now here is the part that most birding content never gets to, the part that the research reveals about house sparrow behavior that is genuinely unsettling in the best possible way. House sparrows are not just reactive to individual humans. They are actively manipulative of them, and that word is used precisely and without exaggeration. In studies of house sparrow behavior at mixed-species feeding stations, researchers observed that sparrows engaged in what can only be described as deliberate social signaling toward the humans who managed the feeders. Sparrows that had learned a specific human consistently replenish seed would increase their visible presence near that human, staying closer than normal, remaining calm when others fled, and producing contact calls at higher rates. These are behaviors that, in human terms, we would call currying favor. In behavioral biology, they are classified as operant conditioning in reverse, the bird shaping human behavior. The sparrow is not simply responding to you. It is actively, measurably trying to influence what you do. It wants you to fill the feeder, and it has learned what behaviors on its part make that more likely. If you have ever felt that a small brown bird seemed particularly interested in getting your attention near the feeder, that was not your imagination projecting meaning onto animal behavior. That was a cognitively sophisticated animal executing a learned social strategy that its predecessors developed over decades of contact with human beings in your neighborhood. The social structure of a house sparrow flock is also far more organized than it appears from the outside. What looks like a random collection of small brown birds at your feeder is not random. House sparrow flocks have stable dominance hierarchies that persist across weeks and months, with individual birds maintaining consistent ranks within the group. Dominant sparrows have priority access to food and preferred perch sites. Subordinate sparrows develop behavioral strategies to work around dominant birds, including timing their feeder visits, using secondary approach routes, and forming alliances. Yes, alliances. Researchers have documented house sparrows forming consistent preferential associations with specific other sparrows, approaching feeders together, defending access together, and sharing information about food location. These associations are not random. They are maintained across time and across spatial distances. They are, by the technical definition used in behavioral ecology, friendships. Birds that weigh 11 grams, that you have walked past your entire life without noticing, are maintaining long-term social relationships within a structured community you cannot see. All of this is already happening every morning at your feeder. But what comes next is the part that most people who love backyard birds have never been told, and genuinely need to hear. The nesting behavior of house sparrows reveals another layer of this hidden complexity. House sparrows do not simply find a cavity and lay eggs. They conduct detailed site assessments. A female house sparrow evaluating a nest site will visit the same location repeatedly over several days, testing the structural integrity, assessing the thermal properties, and monitoring predator activity in the area. She remembers the results of those assessments across visits and integrates them before making a final decision. She is running a multivariable analysis, and researchers can predict her decision based on the factors she weighs. What she is looking for includes proximity to reliable food sources, protection from ambient weather, the presence of other sparrows nearby as indicators of safety, and evidence of previous successful nesting at the site. Your yard is being evaluated by this bird according to criteria that researchers only recently mapped, using cognitive capacities that most people would never associate with something so visually unremarkable. Everything described so far, the brain growth, the social hierarchies, the friendships, the female's careful calculations, paints a picture of an animal that is gentle, subtle, and hidden. That picture is accurate. And it is also incomplete. Because the male house sparrow has a side to him that changes everything you thought you understood about this species. The male house sparrow's territorial behavior during breeding season is among the most aggressive of any small bird in North America, and it is directed not only at other sparrows. A male house sparrow defending a nest site will physically evict birds significantly larger than itself, including bluebirds, tree swallows, wrens, and in documented cases, even small woodpeckers. The evictions are not bluffs. Researchers have documented house sparrows entering nest boxes occupied by bluebirds and killing the occupants, including eggs, nestlings, and adult birds. This behavior is so consistent and so well documented that conservation organizations now specifically warn homeowners installing bluebird boxes to monitor them for house sparrow intrusion. The same bird that calmly eats seed from your feeder while you watch from 5 feet away will commit what ornithologists clinically describe as interspecific killing when its breeding interests are at stake. This is not aberrant behavior. It is regular, documented, species-typical behavior that has been observed across the house sparrow's entire North American range without exception. Understanding this does not make the house sparrow a villain. Every species has behaviors that look different in sharp focus than they do from a distance. What it does is correct a fundamental misperception that follows this bird everywhere it goes, the idea that it is unremarkable, passive, or simple. A species that has colonized a continent in 50 years, restructured its own brain in response to urban environments, maintains long-term social relationships, recognizes individual humans, and defends breeding territory with lethal force is none of those things. It is an extraordinarily successful generalist that evolved alongside human civilization so effectively that it has become effectively invisible to most of us, which was, from a survival standpoint, exactly the point. The house sparrow did not survive 10,000 years of human expansion by being obvious. It survived by being present, adaptable, and strategically unnoticed. Every morning when you look out your window and see the small brown birds moving through your yard, you are looking at the result of one of the most successful evolutionary partnerships ever documented. The bird you never thought about is the one that has been thinking about you, monitoring your yard, mapping your schedule, calibrating its behavior to maximize its survival in your specific presence. That is not nothing. That is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sophisticated things happening in your outdoor space on any given morning. There is a study I want to leave you with, because it is the one that changed how I think about this species, and I think it will do the same for you. In 2018, researchers at the University of Exeter ran a long-term study tracking individual house sparrows in a suburban UK neighborhood across 4 breeding seasons. They found that sparrows living in yards where humans were consistently present and consistently calm around them raised more chicks to fledging than sparrows in yards where human contact was unpredictable. Not because the human presence provided more food. In the experimental design, food availability was controlled and equal across all sites. The difference was behavioral. Sparrows living near calm, predictable humans showed lower baseline stress hormones, spent more time in productive foraging behavior, and maintained stronger pair bonds across seasons. Your presence in your yard, the simple fact of being there calmly and consistently, is measurably positive for the birds that live near you. Not just for the spectacular ones. For the small brown ones that you have walked past 1,000 times without looking twice. The bird everyone loves is the cardinal or the bluebird or the hummingbird, the birds that announce themselves with color and song and spectacle. The bird nobody talks about is the one that has been quietly, persistently, cognitively engaged with human environments for longer than almost any other wild bird on the continent. Both things are true. The spectacular birds are worth watching. And the unremarkable ones are worth looking at again, more slowly, with more attention than you have probably given them before. Tomorrow morning, when you see the brown birds move across your feeder, know that at least some of them know who you are. They have a record of your schedule, a learned assessment of your threat level, and a set of social strategies specifically calibrated for the human they have come to associate with that yard. They are not asking you to love them the way you love the cardinal. They are simply present, watching, adapting, thriving in a landscape shaped by a civilization they learned to read 10,000 years ago. That is the secret side. It was never hidden. It was just small enough that most of us never thought to look. If this video made you see one of the most overlooked birds in your yard differently, share it with someone who needs a reason to stop and look more carefully at the ordinary things. We have more on the science behind the birds in your yard coming soon. The next one covers a behavior in a species you know well that researchers only documented in the last decade.